My name is Austin Faison. I am the American Rescue Plan Act Director for the City of Somerville. I started in July. This is actually my second go-around with the city. I worked in the city from 2012 to 2015 in Somerset and traffic and parking. Happy to be back after some time in Brookline and Winthrop. And this is a really exciting opportunity for the community. I'll take my glasses off for this because the reflection is ridiculous. Not very often do municipalities get around tens of millions of dollars to utilize how they see fit within certain parameters. And that's what we're tasked with right now in the city of Somerville. From the federal government directly, we're getting $61,700,944 from from Middlesex County. What we are getting passed along is $15,803,226 to make a total of $77,504,170. So big numbers. We can allocate this money through fiscal 24 to be utilized through the end of calendar 2026. So exciting times, exciting things to be able to use this money on. But the priority right now is our response to COVID. That is where urgent spending would be focused. We're still in the midst of the pandemic, unfortunately. So we're going to be focusing our initial efforts in those urgent matters. With that, I would like Kate Hart to unmute herself and take a second to introduce herself. She's working with me on another facet of this project. Thanks.
Good evening to the council. It's an honor to be with you all tonight. I just wanted to say hello again. I'm the Grants and External Funds Director, and I've been managing the FEMA and CARES Act dollars, and now I'll be in charge of financial administration, reporting, compliance management for the for the ARPA Rescue Plan Act. So I'm glad to be here tonight and can answer any questions after the presentation that Austin hasn't addressed.
Great, so thank you, Kate. I'm excited to work with Kate. She has a high level of professional responsibility with compliance with these federal level grants. Now I'm going to pass it over to MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, who is working alongside my office for the community engagement portion of the American Rescue Plan Act. It's very important to us, and we're going to explain, give a baseline of ARPA, but then also explain what we're going to be doing with the community engagement process. And with that, I'd like to introduce Lizzie Wyant from MAPC, Emily Torres-Kulane. They will both be speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Austin and Kate. I'm really glad to be here tonight. Mr. President, members of the council, my name is Lizzie Wyant. I am the Director of Government Affairs at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We are your regional planning agency, and we serve the 101 cities and towns of metropolitan Boston. And I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about ARPA, what it is and what it isn't. And then I'll introduce my colleague, Emily Torres-Kulane, who'll talk about those community engagement efforts. Next slide, please. So just by way of background, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law in March of 2021. It was really designed and written to be a recovery bill, and we can contrast this with the relief bills that we saw during the height of the pandemic, which we commonly refer to as the CARES bills. Treasury released materials associated with the state and local recovery funds, which is really what we're focused on tonight. There are lots of other dollars inside the American Rescue Plan Act that states receive directly, and there are some grant opportunities that are available at the federal level too, but we're focusing on these state and local dollars this evening. Treasury has released a guidance document. It's about a 180-page document called their Interim Final Rule. It really does, it has all the legal weight of a final rule, and it governs sort of how we can spend the money and how we can't. They've also since issued a fact sheet and 2 FAQ documents, actually. I need to update this slide, to give a little more guidance to cities and towns and states about how to spend the money. And we have seen some updated funding amounts, which Austin just shared with you, Somerville's amounts. And as he also said, there's a bit of a runway about the money. It has to be obligated by December of 2024 and spent by December of 2026. So you need to keep those dates in mind as you're considering how we spend these dollars. Next slide, please. So the state itself got $5.3 billion and local governments got a total of $3.4 billion. That money was allocated in most instances directly to cities and towns, although in places where there was still a county, money did in fact go to counties. In places where there was no longer a county or the county government had been dissolved, as is true in Somerville, the money went directly to communities. So we have a total of $8.7 billion in the Commonwealth for states, counties, and municipalities. And again, this doesn't count those other dollars that went directly to state agencies. Next slide, please. These are the 4 outlined eligible uses of how we can spend ARPA dollars. And I'll go into these, some of them in a little bit more detail. The first is responding to the public health emergency. The next is about giving premium pay to employees who provided essential work. The third is addressing revenue loss. This is probably the most flexible use of ARPA dollars that you have available. And the fourth is investing in infrastructure. And I can tell you, if you're interested in sort of the background piece, the infrastructure item was the one we were most surprised to see. It was kind of added at about 2:30 in the morning, and the bill was passed at about 2:35. So we were surprised when that piece popped, but glad to see it. Next slide, please. The interim final rule also indicates places where you can't use ARPA dollars. So you may not use funds to offset a reduction in taxes. You may not use funds to pay direct pension liability. You may not use funds to invest in debt servicing. So for a big capital expense, you couldn't take on a debt burden and pay for that with your ARPA dollars. And you can't deposit funds directly into a rainy day or a stabilization funds. The other thing that you can't do with the ARPA dollars is you can't do things that would ultimately lead to investments that look like this by doing other things that are eligible under ARPA dollars. Next slide, please. So I want to talk first about that first category of responding to the public health emergency. That category covers everything you would expect in terms of responding to the public health emergency, all the things that we knew we were going to need to do. So things related to COVID testing, procuring PPE, addressing some basic public health needs. But then the Treasury guidance also says that eligible uses include some of the things that we didn't necessarily expect to be inside this bucket. And that would include, some examples there would include small business and nonprofit assistance, and then even upstream issues related to food security or housing. The one piece that this I think is really interesting inside the responding to public health emergency category is that it specifically calls out aid to disproportionately impacted communities. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit more if we can go to the next slide. So the Treasury guidance calls out this idea of investing in disproportionately impacted communities. It's the first time I've ever seen language like this in any federal guidance, and I've read more than my fair share. The language inside the Treasury guidance gives a lot of flexibility to municipalities and the state to define a disproportionately impacted community. So the Treasury guidance does identify qualified census tracts that were particularly impacted by COVID, but it also allows cities and towns to identify some communities on their own. And it can be based on a whole host of factors where you really feel like there's been a particular residence or community within your community that has been disproportionately impacted by COVID. The 4 buckets that are outlined here really identify some examples of investments in disproportionately impacted communities, which would be deemed eligible ARPA expenses. So if you are making investments in disproportionately impacted communities in any of these 4 categories, those expenses will be deemed ARPA eligible expenses. And as you can see, it's a pretty wide swath of investments. Everything from childhood health to addressing educational disparities, and then some particular instances of domestic violence intervention. And again, these are all illustrative, so you're not actually helmed in by the examples that are included in the Treasury guidance. Next slide, please. I want to quickly touch on the next 2 of the major 4 categories for investment. The revenue replacement category, as I said, is a very flexible use of ARPA dollars. They do, again, inside the guidance, call out some of those prohibited uses. And I think it's very important, when I was saying before, you cannot kind of, I refer to it as the moving the cups around game. You can't move the cups around to effectuate one of the prohibited uses of ARPA funds by using them for revenue replacement. And I think it's also worth noting that communities have to be careful about investing too much in revenue replacement, because it artificially inflates your budget and could set you up for a really difficult budget situation in the future years when the money is no longer available. The next category around premium pay, I think the only thing here to note is that we originally thought this was just going to be for public sector workers, but they did open it up to an availability for private sector workers, particularly those who were the groups that we were calling essential workers at the height of the pandemic. Next slide, please. There we go. So the last category of eligible ARPA expenditures is around water, sewer, and broadband. Again, kind of an important thing to note here is that they do in the guidance specifically call out strong labor standards agreements. So again, one of the first times I've ever seen this in Treasury and federal guidance, so it was good to see. They do also call out making investments in water and sewer infrastructure, particularly as it relates to climate change. And so I think there are a lot of investments that communities across the MAPC region and honestly across the Commonwealth are poised to make with that in mind. And then the last category is actually one that MAPC is already doing a lot of work on with some of our communities around broadband infrastructure. Next slide. So I wanted to just note very quickly that the governor has filed legislation that would impact essentially that $5.3 billion that went directly to the state. The legislature now has control of those dollars and is taking up the governor's proposal. They've had a series of hearings already about how the state should spend their money. This is just an example of what the governor put forth. I don't expect the legislature to take all of his suggestions exactly as he drafted them. But I think the important thing to note about the fact that the state also has dollars is that we have been encouraging the state to act quickly to get those dollars out the door, because we think the sooner the state acts to spend their recovery dollars, the more certainty it will give cities and towns as they're thinking about how to spend or complement potentially local investments with potential other state opportunities for investment. Next slide. So the last thing I just want to highlight for you is that there are very robust reporting requirements that are included inside the Treasury guidance. There are FAQ, there is a lot of information out there about how to do the reporting requirements, and I believe the Division of Local Services is holding a webinar on this next week. I think the very interesting thing about these reporting requirements is that they will happen across the country. So we will get some very early apples to apples comparisons about how other municipalities and counties and states are investing their ARPA dollars and what it looks like when they make investments in certain categories. So we're glad to see that these reporting requirements are there. They're not uncomplicated, and I think Treasury will be looking at them very closely to get a sense of how those expenditures will be made. We had heard originally that Congress might try to claw back some dollars. I do not think that is going to happen, but I do think cities and towns need to hew very closely to the Treasury guidance and make sure that they're spending their ARPA dollars on eligible expenses. I think that is actually the last slide for me, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Emily Torres-Cullinane to talk about our engagement efforts.
Thank you, Lizzie, and I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. So if you can't hear me, you can let me know. All right, so I would like to now present what we have planned as the community engagement process for Somerville for the ARPA funding. So my name is Emily Torres-Cullinane, and I am the co-director of strategic initiatives at MAPC. I am joined with 4 other staff members, and our expertise is in designing community engagement strategies. We work with the cities and towns in metropolitan Boston, and I've actually been working at MAPC for more than a decade, and my team has been working in Somerville. And actually, the 2 sort of main people on this project are myself and my colleague Christian, who is with me tonight, and he is a Somerville resident. I believe he lives a couple of streets away from City Hall, and of course is going to be, you know, not putting his opinion into the engagement, but he is leading and will be listening very carefully to his fellow residents. We also, between the 5 of us, speak Spanish fluently, speak a little bit of Portuguese, and for any other languages that we don't have, we will be partnering with the community as well as hiring interpreters and translators. So the community engagement strategy, we would really like to sort of have a very clear purpose for this ARPA outreach and engagement. We feel it is very important to develop a base collective knowledge of learning about how the ARPA funding can be used in the city, and make sure that that is very clear throughout our process. We want to make sure to engage all stakeholders in conversations around ARPA and have an additional focus on populations that were hardest hit by the pandemic and its economic impacts, including communities of color, renters, low-income residents, and non-English speaking residents. We want to explore community priorities for how the funding should be used, and make sure to share with staff as well as, you know, the council what we heard were resident priorities. Engagement activities will focus on providing clear and accessible information about the ARPA funding that Somerville will receive, including what that money can and can't be used, and for what the city's high priority initial emergency spending plans are. We want to make sure to create opportunities for Somerville residents to share priorities and program suggestions with the city to inform further ARPA spending that best serves the community. In terms of language and accessibility, this is one of our top priorities, is to have an equitable and inclusive process. So we will have a 12-person outreach team with a mix of adults as well as youth engagement. We will incorporate 6 languages into our outreach. We are very much partnering with the Office of Immigrant Affairs in Somerville, as well as the Communications Department to do this outreach. We will have, again, like as I mentioned, where possible, interpreted meetings and translated materials and clear information so people can understand the sort of the ins and outs of this funding. We'll have targeted outreach. We'll work to meet community members where they are. And again, there will be a priority for underrepresented population, and just have very, very clear information about what this program can do. For messaging and communications, we will again set expectations from the beginning, and we will coordinate with the city's communication department. We will have a website. So we will have an interactive website and an online portal that Austin will be showcasing later today. It is now live, so you can visit SomervilleMA.gov/ARPA. We're using OpenGov as the platform, and again, it is interactive, and it will be showing up-to-date information, and we will be showing that later today. We will also make sure to update projects submitted and approved for funding on that portal. Austin will also have office hours, and we will include other engagement staff to have office hours at least 3 times a week at different times, and people can use this tool Calendly or schedule something through our emails, and our phone numbers will be available. We will also engage community leaders and really look to partner with folks already in the city of Somerville to make sure we cast a wide net, and we have other community leaders also spreading this word and hearing, listening for feedback. We will have focus groups. We will have a community priority survey, and we will have 2 forums. Hopefully, we will be using we will have the date soon for the October forum, and we will have another forum in January. And so that you can see this a little bit more in a timeline fashion, today is really sort of this internal kickoff for our engagement with tonight's presentation. We will have a city staff focus group in the next month. We will be collecting information about community leaders to work with. Our website, again, is live in October, late October. A date will come out very soon for our kickoff forum. We will be going to community events in October to January. We'll be making sure to have focus groups that reach populations throughout the city. We will have a community survey that will come out in late October into November, and then our next forum will be in February. We will continue to do engagement throughout the winter, and we will have a final summary at the end of the spring. Regular opportunities for you all to be updated. There will be newsletters, notification of community and of events and forums that we will be doing. Again, the website is a resource as well as this Calendly scheduling tool. Here's our information. So if you have any questions after today, you will have the slides, you will have our contact information,